Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, September 29th. And tonight, we begin with some good news for Canada's economy, which grew slightly in July. Now, this is because the latest reading on real gross domestic product came in higher than expected. Statistics Canada says the economy grew by 0.1% in July. It outperformed its preliminary estimate that pointed to a contraction by the same amount. The federal agency says growth in goods-producing industries was partially offset by a decline in the services-producing industries. As the Bank of Canada continues to raise interest rates to tame inflation, an economic slowdown is widely anticipated. Canada's military has been called upon in the aftermath of post-tropical storm Fiona in Atlantic Canada over the weekend. Defense Minister Anita Anand says there are now 700 military members there. They are helping with the cleanup after Fiona left much of the region in tatters. Ms. Anand says Canadian Armed Forces members in Nova Scotia, PEI, and southwestern Newfoundland are helping to clear debris, reopen roads, check on residents, and assess damage. The minister says additional troops are on standby, along with some ships and aircraft. Meanwhile, Governor General Mary Simon is in Regina today to speak at a Truth and Reconciliation event. Mayo Wet'suwet'en Day aims to bring together 10,000 high school students, business leaders, and members of the public at Mosaic Stadium. The name draws on a Cree phrase that means walking together in a good way or reconciliation. The event is meant to educate people ahead of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation tomorrow. Well, some drivers across Canada will notice they're paying a lot more at the gas pumps today. This even though the average national increase was just over 3 cents. CAA's gas price tracker says the price of gas nationally is $1.58 per liter. This with some provinces seeing higher jumps than others. In Saskatchewan, prices are up almost 6 cents, while Alberta saw an average increase of 6.5 cents, including a 9-cent jump in Edmonton. Gas prices in Ontario are up by an average of 2 cents, but it's a different story in Thunder Bay. This is where they spiked by almost 20 cents, and in Peterborough by 11 cents, compared to just around a cent in Toronto. Atlantic Canadians affected by post-tropical storm Fiona last weekend are about to get a break from the tax man. The Canada Revenue Agency is extending tomorrow's tax deadline by 1 month. This is for people, businesses, and charities in the Atlantic provinces and the Isle de la Madeleine region in Quebec. And anyone who can't pay their taxes because of Fiona will have their requests reviewed on a priority basis. Well, for those who think cryptocurrencies are a good way to avoid inflation, that's not the case, at least according to senior federal bureaucrats. They assessed the viability of digital currencies after claims by opposition leader Pierre Poilievre. This was during his campaign for the Conservative leadership. Mr. Poilievre had suggested that digital currencies could help Canadians opt out of inflation. This is because they are not influenced by central banks. But a briefing note from the Privy Council office obtained by CP says crypto hasn't provided protection against inflation and is a poor substitute for the Canadian dollar for day-to-day transactions. Turning to Ontario now, which is asking to extend the life of the Pickering Nuclear Generating Station by 1 year. Energy Minister Todd Smith says he has asked Ontario Power Generation to keep the plant going until September 2026. The plant accounted for 14% of Ontario's electricity generation last year and is supposed to shut down in 2025. The plan still needs approval from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. On the West Coast, BC's coroner's service says the number of overdose deaths has dropped last month compared to July. The service says illicit drug toxicity is the leading cause of unnatural death in BC. This with an average of 184 drug deaths each month since October 2020. Last month, 169 people died as a result of drugs. This represents a 12% decrease from July. Canada Post is launching 4 new stamps showcasing the vision for truth and reconciliation from the perspective of Indigenous artists. The Crown Corporation says this is the first in an annual series meant to encourage reflection on the painful legacy of Canada's residential schools. The stamps are inscribed with the Indigenous language of each of their creators. And it was a big win for Team Canada on Thursday. Canada's national women's basketball team has advanced to its first World Cup semifinals since 1986. This with a 79-60 win over Puerto Rico. Next up for Canada is a matchup tomorrow with the U.S. Well, good luck to that team. Forum Daily will be right back after the break, where we're going to be speaking with Brendan Caldwell of Caldwell Securities Ltd about the effect of natural disasters on the markets. Stay with us. Atlantic Canadians continue to pick up the pieces following post-tropical storm Fiona, while many are still assessing the overall impact of the storm on infrastructure, businesses, local economies, and maybe even the markets. South of the border, Florida is dealing with its own dangerous weather, with Hurricane Ian leaving a path of destruction in the Sunshine State. As hurricanes, flooding, and wildfires continue to become more common in North America, how will these climate disasters impact investors? Well, joining us now to talk more on this is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Ltd. Brendan, welcome back.
Thank you, Nima.
So how do stock markets react to hurricanes, Brendan?
It'd have to be pretty big, like Katrina big, for stock markets to actually care, except in limited sectors where, say, it's hitting Louisiana and the Gulf states where there's a lot of oil refining, and that could and did push up the price of oil and gas. Well, right now, oil and gas is such a mess and supply constrained on a global basis that one more constraint, I don't know how much effect it'll actually have. The states that tend to get hit the hardest are typically not the most industrialized. However, it is perhaps a bit cynically, natural disasters in general, and hurricanes included, are opportunities for companies that wish to report bad news to be able to say, well, it's because of this natural disaster, this hurricane, it impacted us this much. So it's an opportunity to put all the bad news out at once. So it can be used by companies, but as terms of overall market impact, except for specific sectors like oil and gas, tends to have a minimal impact.
All right, Brendan. Well, talking about major hurricanes, we know last year Hurricane Ida affected some key industries. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that'd be an example where agriculture was hit. It really hit the Gulf states. That's Louisiana and these places where they do a lot of the oil refining in the U.S. So in terms of gasoline, energy, agriculture, there are some impacts there. Unfortunately, most of the impact tends to be on actual real human beings, real lives, real property where people live, where they're trying to make a life. The flooding and the damage there, that's the real tragedy, as opposed to markets, which perhaps a bit cynically do sort of go, eh. So I think really one's heart and prayers go out for the people that are directly affected more than the money managers on this one.
Now, talking about this damage in Atlantic Canada, we've heard that the insured losses, the estimates would be up to $700 million. So what does that mean, Brendan?
Well, you'd think, oh, wouldn't it be really bad for insurance companies, specifically for property and casualty insurance companies like Intact or Allstate or even the vaunted Berkshire Hathaway. But really, disasters are usually, in a perverse way, good for insurers, for property and casualty insurers, because it allows them to increase their rates, introduce new markets. So people that never had flood protection on this go round are going to say, yeah, I got to get me some of that flood protection. So insurers actually, while they may have headline numbers that they have to pay out, do find themselves medium to longer term benefiting from higher rates and the opening up of new markets. So you're not going to need to have a tag day for Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway over this one.
Now, that's really interesting, Brendan. What about the economic fallout from Fiona to Atlantic provinces and maybe even the rest of Canada?
Well, that's a tougher one because, again, it's the people that are affected and the power companies. Many people on the East Coast have been without power for protracted periods. And I don't know if the footage you showed at the beginning of the segment was from actual Hurricane Ian down in Florida, or whether that was what they call stock footage. But to the extent that you have major flooding and major property damage, there is both a cost, but also an economic opportunity in rebuilding. And hopefully, to borrow from American cousins, an opportunity to build back better. Or maybe not in the same place, because these areas that get hit tend to get hit over and over again. So if you're expecting to live on a coastline in the 21st century, I think you can reasonably expect that hurricanes, floods, and other sort of natural calamities are going to be a part of life. So if you're going to build there, you're going to need to build back better. So it's an opportunity from that perspective.
All right, Brendan, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you, and we pray for all the people that have been affected by Fiona and for Ian.
All right, welcome back. Now it's time for our weekly market update with Catherine Murray, host of The Buck Stops Here. Take it away, Catherine.
Thanks, Nima. Hello, everyone, and welcome to your weekly market recap. I'm Catherine Murray. Well, we are seeing markets trend broadly lower today. The Dow down by over 500 points, or close to 1.7%. The TSX also down by about 1.8%. This, of course, follows a big bounce in the markets yesterday. In fact, stopping a 6-day slide where the TSX actually lost over 6%. And the S&P yesterday was up by about 2%. But again, we're not able to hold these gains. And that is the consensus view, which is don't buy the dips. There's still a lot of concern out there in the market in terms of the U.S. Federal Reserve raising rates too aggressively, and that will in fact cause a hard landing, not a soft landing. And that is what is getting priced into the market day after day. There's also, of course, a concern that that earnings need to come down, and therefore, what multiple do you want to put on the earnings? What market multiple that is? We are also, of course, hearing from one of the Fed presidents out of Cleveland saying that the central banks need to be very attuned to risks that something might break. In other words, perhaps we might be too aggressive. And don't forget, we have a global group of central banks all raising rates. So you have to think about what that does to the valuations of risk assets and, of course, currencies. That's another big focus here for the marketplace today. I also just want to point out that the U.S. 10-year yield is above that 4%. That also always puts jitters in investors' mindsets. Away from that, there's a lot of focus, of course, globally on a number of events, specifically the UK. Prime Minister Truss did defend her unfunded tax cuts, trying to, of course, boost their economy there. We also had German flash inflation numbers that came in hotter than expected. And importantly as well, OPEC Plus has begun talks on an output cut ahead of next week's meeting. So therefore, again, concerns on the supply side front. In terms of stock news, I would note that Apple did get a downgrade over at B of A. That stock looks to be down by about 2% on that analyst news. Starbucks increased their dividend by just over 8%. And BRK, Berkshire, boosted their stake in Oxy, Occidental Petroleum, so the energy space, to just under 21%. And importantly as well, in terms of how we're looking at the market and the broader macro backdrop, CarMax, ticker there is KMX, missed on their numbers. That stock down by about 20%. So again, we also want to look at these stocks in terms of what the macro read is. Obviously not good as it relates to looking at CarMax's results. Away from that, as we take a look at the TSX, as I mentioned, it did finish higher yesterday, but it has been down by over 6% over the past 6 days, and it's down once again today with the broader markets. Also importantly to note, which is getting a lot of attention, that US dollar is strong versus most major currencies, including the Canadian dollar. But I've said this before, when you look at the weakness in the Canadian dollar, which again, it is lower versus USD today, it's telling you that more and more people are concerned about the Canadian economic outlook. There are recession risks here. In fact, the Globe and Mail discussing the fact that with our trading partners heading for a recession, a soft landing here in Canada is perhaps less likely. I would point out that July's real GDP rose 0.1%. That was a little bit better than expected, of a negative 0.1%, but nonetheless, the economy is in fact slowing. And importantly, BMO has a survey which showed 81% of Canadians are worried that the economy will in fact tip into a recession by year end. Interestingly as well, I know I say that word a lot, but Alberta is expected to hold up better because of their oil revenues. And the BOC, just to put this in your notebook, is still expected to hike by 50 basis points at the next meeting. No abating there, which again continues to put pressure on the consumer. Following a transparency review by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, this is important, the BOC, the Bank of Canada, has decided to show their meeting notes following their BOC meetings. That, of course, is what the Fed does, and this is in the vein of transparency. Away from that, as it relates to our energy industry, LNG Canada's CEO says and has emphasized that a strong case for doubling our nat gas exports as Canada's first LNG export terminal nears completion in BC. Remember, there's a lot of people around the world that would love some of our energy. Speaking of energy, lastly, CNQ was upgraded to the action buy list over at TD from buy. Nima, I'll leave it there. Back to you.
All right, thanks for that, Catherine. Again, that was Forum Daily's weekly market update with Catherine Murray. For more financial news, tune in to Catherine's market-focused program, The Buck Stops Here, airing on Sundays at 9 a.m. Eastern, only on the News Forum Network. All right, stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after a quick break. NATO warns of retaliation for any attacks on the critical infrastructure of the 30 member countries. This comes as it suggested that damage to 2 gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea is the result of sabotage. The alliance said Thursday that the pipelines between Russia and Germany are of deep concern. NATO added that it seems that this is the result of deliberate, reckless, and irresponsible acts of sabotage. The Swedish Coast Guard has confirmed a 4th leak on the Nord Stream pipelines just off southern Sweden. Meanwhile, Russia has announced that tomorrow will see the annexation of parts of Ukraine where separation referendums were successful. The Kremlin spokesman confirms the expectations of Ukrainian and Western officials who have denounced the Moscow-managed votes as illegal, forced, and rigged. The 4 regions set to be annexed include Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia. A Kremlin ceremony celebrating the capture and absorption of the regions will be attended by President Vladimir Putin. Turning to South Korea now, where the military says North Korea has fired at least 1 ballistic missile toward its eastern waters. The launch on Thursday came hours after U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris departed from South Korea, which was the last stop of a 4-day Asian trip. Thursday's launch was the 3rd round of missile tests by North Korea this week. Police in Norway say several people in a violent crowd attempted to enter the Iranian embassy in Oslo. Scuffles broke out and rocks were thrown at officers, and police said 90 people were detained. A crowd on Thursday had gathered outside the diplomatic mission in Oslo. This was to protest the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in custody in Iran. She died September 16th after being detained by Iran's police. All right, switching gears to balloting in Kuwait, where voters are returning to the polls for the 2nd parliamentary elections in less than 2 years. Many will be hoping to move the wealthy Gulf Arab nation out of a prolonged period of political gridlock. Kuwait has the freest and most active assembly in the Persian Gulf. However, political power is still largely concentrated in the hands of the ruling Al Sabah family. It appoints the prime minister and cabinet and can dissolve the assembly at any time. In the UK, British Prime Minister Liz Truss is defending her economic plan, and she says she's willing to make difficult decisions to get the economy growing. Now, this was her first public comments since her government's announcement of billions in uncosted tax cuts roiled the markets and drove the pound to record lows. The Bank of England took emergency action yesterday to stabilize UK financial markets and head off a crisis in the broader economy. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy shrank at an annual rate of 0.6% in the 2nd quarter. This comes after it was battered by surging consumer prices and rising interest rates. That was unchanged from the U.S. government's previous 2nd quarter estimate. It was the 2nd consecutive quarter of economic contraction in the U.S., which is just one informal rule of thumb for a recession. But economists say they believe the world's biggest economy is not yet in a downturn, citing a strong and resilient American job market. New frontline Amazon workers in the U.S. are getting $1 an hour raises. The company is boosting its average starting pay to $19 an hour. This to try to attract more employees in a tight labor market as the holiday season approaches. Amazon's estimated billion-dollar pay bump comes as the online retail giant faces a growing unionization movement inside of its warehouses, which was driven by worker complaints over pay and working conditions. Hurricane Ian has left a path of destruction through southwest Florida. Damage assessments are underway as coastal floodwaters recede, but the status of people on cut-off barrier islands remains unclear. Ian trapped residents in flooded homes and damaged the roof of a hospital's intensive care unit. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis says rescue teams have been working since first light to rescue trapped individuals. Mr. DeSantis says there has been significant power failures from the storm. Prime Video is pulling a new documentary out of its tickle trunk. The Amazon-owned streaming service says production begins this fall on the feature-length look at the legacy of the late Canadian children's entertainer Ernie Coombs, who is better known as Mr. Dress-Up. The project will trace the origins of Mr. Dress-Up, which had a 29-year run of 4,000 episodes on CBC until 1996. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.